Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, Medgar Evers College, University of New York. I am Professor O. Felix Obi, and today is Tuesday, April 22nd, 2025. And let me begin by saying two things. First, welcome from spring break. And second of all, there is some construction going on upstairs. So throughout the course of this lecture, unfortunately, you may hear some pops and bangs. That's just the wood flooring being worked on upstairs. Um, and let me also quickly address another housekeeping matter, which is the fact that you would have um, two sets of assignments due by 11:59 p.m. on Friday. The first, of course, is your term paper, which I hope you should have finished by now. I'm barely just hanging on to it for some reason instead of submitting it, or perhaps you're giving it a second over, because I would have to imagine that you have already given it a once over. But I look forward to reading those papers. So again, the due date is 11:59 p.m. Friday this week. And of course, separate from the term paper, you also have two separate sets of weekly assessments that would also be due by 11:59 p.m. on Friday. So welcome back, and without much ado, let's get into today's lecture. Of course, right after the lecture, we will go into Q&A and then office hours. Um, welcome to our office hour lecture for Module 12. As I hope you now know from this week's assessment, our discussion will be on international economic development. Today's lecture will focus on the drivers of economic development. We will discuss international political economy perspective, historical materialism, liberal and realistic perspective, and the linkage between economic development and trade relations. Again, listening to the news and paying attention to current events, you could see that we're literally witnessing the world as a backdrop to the topics that we cover in this class. So I tell everyone that there could not be a more exciting period. Of course, for the markets and for our economy, for our pockets, there are uncertainties. But as an academic pursuit, there could not be a more exciting period than now to take Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy. So, notably, the plight of underdeveloped and poverty-stricken nations has been, at least in part, attributed to the structure of global trade relations. Indeed, many people around the world live in poverty. Many nations in Africa, Asia, Central and South America are economically underdeveloped. For perspective, consider that there are many places in the world where people live on less than $5 per day. So, what should an effective theory of development contemplate? Liberal economic theory, as we have so often covered in this class, holds that a liberalized global market and trading system is the best way to increase economic development and growth. Because each country specializes, that is, in a globalized and liberalized global market, each country specializes in producing goods and services in which it has comparative advantage. We have, of course, covered ad nauseum the definition of comparative advantage. However, this view has been subjected to contention for decades. Again, apologies if you hear the saw going on upstairs. That's woodwork. Sincere apologies. Um, so This view on liberalized global markets has been subject to contention, at least the benefits of liberalized global markets that is built and based on comparative advantages has been subjected to contention for decades. There is evidence that simply removing barriers to trade and opening markets has not led towards the development and growth of underdeveloped and poverty-stricken nations. Rich countries and large corporations dominate the global marketplace and create unequal relations of power and information. Consequently, there is inherently unequal and poor countries that whom seldom experience rising out of increasing unemployment, poverty, and income inequality. An additional problem is that free trade is not equally free. Non-market policy hints such as been in the news, non-market policies such as subsidy cause a misalignment between prices and production costs in the global economy. This impairs the efficient operation of free market systems. We are living through a period where, within the last year, even preceding President Trump's inauguration in his second term, the United States placed tariff on Chinese electric vehicles because of uneconomic business practice, i.e., subsidy on China's electric cars. And so has the European Union also placed subsidy on Chinese electric cars. And as has Brazil, who, for that matter, is a member of BRICS, which is considered a global advocacy for an advocacy for global South countries. Others would see it more broadly as a counterweight to Bretton Woods institutions. So we can see how subsidies distort markets. Furthermore, trade is still dominated by multinational corporations whom new trade rules are thought to disproportionately benefit. On the other hand, the liberal view would argue that least developed countries or LDCs' economic problems stem more from inefficient domestic policy than from their dependent position in the global economy. At this point, I will remind the class of another phrase that I mentioned earlier this semester that is one of those phrases that are critical to understanding economics at a fundamental level, and that is dialectical thinking, which is that you need to understand an issue from all sides to fully grasp the magnitude and be able to make a qualified determination or an informed determination. In this case, things hardly fall into the binary black and white knowledge of this is right or that is wrong. It becomes unbalanced. Here is what I think. So there are two sides to this conversation, obviously. And in this way, liberals view that least developed countries, their economic problems stem from more inefficient domestic policy than from their dependent position in the global economy. Indeed, liberals often see North-South interdependent linkages as providing more benefits for the global South than for the global North. By this logic, least developed countries that follow open market economic policies and increase linkages with the North are, therefore, more likely to achieve successful development. On the other hand, while liberals encourage LDCs to follow open market-oriented policies, interventionist liberals, also called reformist liberals, recognize that North-South inequalities, meaning the global North versus the global South inequalities, can put least developed countries at a disadvantage, realizing, of course, that the global North and the global South are shorthand in the case of Global North, for industrialized, mostly Western countries, and the Global South is shorthand for least developed countries, mostly south of the equator, but not exclusive. So, whereas Orthodox liberals emphasize equal treatment and reciprocity, interventionist liberals call on the North, i.e., the Global North, to consider the special needs of the Global South countries. Even so, interventionist liberals believe that the necessary changes can occur within the existing capitalist order, and as such, share the fate of other liberals in private enterprise and the market. So, interventionist liberals are not calling for a dismantling of the international order. They merely recognize that the system, the international system, recognize that there are unique needs and has to be adjusted to address the unique challenges of the global south. Not surprisingly, historical materialists and their dependency theory reject the liberal view that LDC economic problems, again, least developed country economic problems, result from inefficient domestic policies. Instead, they see capitalist states in the core of the global economy, i.e., the global north, as either underdeveloping, least developing countries on the periphery or preventing them from attaining genuine autonomous development. So they are arguing, historical materialists are arguing, that the international order is explicitly set up to maintain the hegemony of the global north and the subjugation, for lack of a better phrase, of the global south. At least that is their position. Historical materialists would further argue that class linkages also play a role, with elites in the south, i.e., the comprador class, collaborating with capitalists in the north to reinforce the pattern of least developed country dependency. Of note, world systems theorists have modified the dependency argument by introducing a third category of countries, the semi-periphery, because some least developed countries, such as in East Asia and Latin America, can now be described as newly industrializing economies. Countries, and I'm thinking Vietnam as one classic example, countries may move upwards from the periphery to the semi-periphery, or even the core, but this only rarely occurs. Whereas some historical materialists call for a redistribution of resources from the core to the periphery, others believe that the core will never willingly transfer resources. Building on this foundational knowledge, we can now advance the following 4 learning outcomes for this week. 1. Describe the role of the World Bank in promoting and assisting development. And I hope by now everyone in the class must know that the World Bank has a stated aim to reduce global poverty, and that the World Bank is actually a series of banks or institutions grouped into one that provide assistance to countries and companies in the global south. Describe and explain export-led growth strategy. Again, based on your weekly assessment, I hope everybody now understands this. And next, a classic export-led growth strategy would be what occurs in China and what is occurring, at least prior to the current tariff snafu, what is occurring in other countries such as Vietnam, and in many ways, Mexico south of our border, recognizing that many of the washing machines, televisions, and other household electronics an increasing number of them refrigerators, white goods, are now made in Mexico. Many of these are not made for domestic consumption in Mexico. They are made as part of an economic growth strategy to take advantage of the relative low wages in Mexico relative to US and Canada, the other USMCA countries, and be able to manufacture at a competitive advantage while selling in the high margin countries of the United States and Canada. So this is an export-led growth strategy in Mexico, as is true for decades, China, and increasingly so also for Vietnam. And I mentioned Vietnam with some intentionality, especially as many of the firms in Vietnam are actually Chinese. And the Chinese are increasingly investing in manufacturing capacity in Vietnam. Indeed, some of the investments in Mexico as well are Chinese, and they are pursuing this strategy of building widgets in China, in Vietnam or Mexico, among other countries, as an export strategy to the United States and markets of the European Union. And they do this as a hedge against potential sanctions against China. The challenge they now face is that the sanctions, while US sanctions, while it is most heavily on China, other countries have not fully escaped sanctions, at least as currently envisioned. The third learning outcome is to describe and explain import substitution development strategies. That is protection and incubation of newly formed domestic industries to fully developed sectors so the goods produced are competitive with imported goods. So this idea again, and there is also a level of when import substitution is done right, I should also add, there is a level of specialization built on acute knowledge of the local market that can also occur in these domestically produced goods relative to their international competitors. Of course, the idea of import substitution is that the national government is also going to institute barriers to protect the domestic market, at least until that market is mature enough to be able to go against international competitors. I am thinking with respect to, as one example, as the Chinese auto industry. Up until a few years ago, the Chinese government ran what they call the 2+2. I believe that's what it's called, the 2+2 formula, which is that if you wanted to sell cars in China, and you wanted to export them into China, export them from your country and into China. There was very high tariff that rendered those cars essentially economically uncompetitive because you would have to sell them at about 3, 4, 5 times over their market value, and nobody would simply want to do that. So the easiest way to get into the huge Chinese market of over 1.5 billion people up until recently was to go into a joint venture, was to set up shop within China. But to do that, you would have to go into a joint venture with a Chinese firm. And you cannot own more than 50% of that joint venture. And you may not set up more than 2 joint ventures. So with this, the Chinese quickly built their competence on how to build cars because foreign companies were forced into partnership with Chinese firms. The other thing the Chinese government did, which they should get credit for, is that the government took a strategic, of course, it's a command economy, and many of the economic strategy, unlike a typical free market economy, is centrally planned. There was a strategy from the get-go for the Chinese to take market leadership in electric cars. So building on the competence that they quickly grasped from the 50-50 joint ventures with foreign automobile companies, and the state strategy to focus on electric cars, the Chinese, and indeed, some might argue on economic practices, the Chinese have taken leadership in um, in 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 electric cars, and that is a good example of import substitution development strategy. The fourth, of course, is to explain the infant industry argument and its justification in economic growth strategy. Again, the main rationale behind the infant industry argument is that new industries require protection because they lack the economies of scale that competitors possess. I'm hoping that by now everyone in the class understands what economies of scale would refer to. Infant industries, for instance, lack the capabilities to leverage their existing production, often lack the capabilities to leverage their existing production and require protection until they can acquire similar economies of scale. So the idea is if you want to develop and you begin to incubate industries that you have to be able to provide them space and the opportunity to grow, gain economies of scale, which is the unit cost. So, just quick explanation, of course. To produce any goods or service, there is what you call fixed cost, and there is what you call variable cost. Fixed cost is the cost you sink into plant, fixed infrastructure, building, machinery, tools. Those have sunken costs. Whether you make one car or 30, if 30 is the capacity of the plant, 30 a day, that fixed cost is the fixed cost. So the more cars you sell, the more you can amortize the cost of that fixed cost over the number of units that you sell. And that becomes economies of scale and it makes your business more profitable. All things being equal, the more market share you capture and the more goods and services you sell. But to have that happen, that explains the infant industry argument and its justification in economic growth. And with that, we bring to conclusion our Module 12 lecture. For next week, our focus will be the international debt crisis. But before then, I do really look forward with a lot of excitement into reading your term papers and, of course, your weekly assessments for this week. So there are three distinct assignments that I began to reiterate that will be due this Friday. Again, one is your term paper, which you've had for going on, I believe, 3 weeks. The second is your first of two assessments for this week. The third is your second of two assessments for this week. So good luck, everyone, and welcome back from spring break. Cheers.